Hello and welcome to Console Classics 101. In this installment, the system is the Sega Genesis, or Sega MegaDrive as it was known in every region except for North America. The Sega Genesis was launched in 1988, originally in Japan, as a Kickstarter to the 16-bit generation, ahead of the Super Famicom and just tailing a little bit behind the PC Engine, which was known in North America as the TurboGrafx 16. Unlike the TurboGrafx 16, the Sega Genesis was a true 16-bit platform with a 16-bit processor that ran games that looked far better than what the PC Engine could provide, even though that the PC Engine could provide some really good-looking games. The 16-bit generation was a big firestorm when it came to competition. The 16-bit system to get, which was it? Was it the Genesis or was it the Super Nintendo, or should you get the pseudo 16-bit system, the PC Engine or TurboGrafx 16? This was really a fiery time for the gaming industry as a whole, but here I'm going to be talking about the Sega Genesis exclusively. The Genesis had a number of advantages over the 8-bit platforms that came before it. For one thing, it jumped to a much faster processor. The Genesis had a 7.6 megahertz processor compared to the NES and Famicom's 1.79, and the Master System, which was the previous console that Sega produced, that had a 4 megahertz processor. And it's crazy to think, because in a generation where 16-bit systems were going head-to-head, even the Super Nintendo had a 4 megahertz processor compared to the almost 8 megahertz of the Genesis. However, processor speeds are not the only determining factor when it comes to which platform is better or more powerful or any of these kind of things. The Genesis used a lot of off-the-shelf components that were very similar to arcade machines at the time, and the Super Nintendo, when that came along, used very custom parts. And as a result, the Super Nintendo did a lot of things that the Genesis couldn't, and the Genesis did a lot of things that the Super Nintendo couldn't. And due to that, you can't really compare them. It's like comparing apples and oranges. You know, they both might be fruit, but it's really up to personal preference which one you like better. The Genesis had this rather unique controller when it was first introduced. This is the original controller, the 3-button controller. Compared to the NES and systems of the 80s, this had one additional fire button that allowed you to have basically 3 buttons. Usually you'd have, an attack and a jump button, and then you'd have like some sort of special attack button. And this worked very well for quite some time, at least in the early days of the Sega Genesis. Having 3 buttons was a really boon for the Sega Genesis in its early years. However, over time, this eventually would become an issue, as Super Nintendo games had 6 action buttons, 4 on the front and 2 shoulder buttons. As a result, games on the Super Nintendo could be more complex in their controls, and over the course of time, people began to, develop games and develop preferences for the Super Nintendo because it had a more advanced controller. In response to this, Sega eventually came up with this controller, which is the, of course, famous 6-button Genesis controller. Having one of the best D-pads of its generation, it's debatable whether this D-pad is better than the Super Nintendo's or not. Again, that's, up to personal preference. But it had not only the original 3 action buttons, but another 3 action buttons, the X, Y, and Z buttons. These 3 buttons allowed you to have a much more variety in your controls, and over time, Genesis games eventually began to accept these controls. But in case you didn't have this controller, you could still use the 3-button controller instead. A lot of games, supported both, and a lot of games didn't even use these 3 buttons unless they were absolutely required for certain titles. Now, the Sega Genesis used a lot of cool things about it. For one thing, this is the original model of the Sega Genesis hardware, the high-definition graphics model. This one has been extensively modified, but it's still the Model 1 Sega Genesis. Throughout the course of the Sega Genesis and Sega MegaDrive, the system had many revisions of the hardware. Not only in completely different revisions in exterior casing, but they also had drastically different motherboard revisions. Which Genesis is actually the best? It depends on who you ask, but most people who are really into the Sega Genesis will tell you to get one of these things, which is the original model that has one of the earlier motherboard revisions. And there's a number of reasons why. For one thing that this thing has is a headphone jack, which is kind of neat, and there's a volume slider here. This allows you to plug in headphones and not disturb other people when you're playing your system, which is kind of neat. In addition to that, it has, if I flip over to the back of it, now this system has been extensively modified, like I said, but it has the same composite RF and RGB video output jack as the Sega Master System. So if you still have that system, you can use that same cable with the system. Now, since that's not good enough for me, I wanted other things. So in addition to that, I have an S-Video cable installed. This is composite. This is an unused jack that's just there just because it's there. And component inputs. Yay, component. In addition to that, I have a reason switch and a overclock switch. But I'm not even going to get into that. When you're buying a Sega Genesis, there's a couple things that you should keep in mind. Genesis games and Mega Drive games, as opposed to the Super Nintendo and PC Engine games, came in these clamshell cases, especially if the games aren't very good. So yeah, if you open them up, you can find that your games can be protected, and they'll stand the test of time far more than just simply cart only. Finding cart-only copies of Genesis games is still common, but more often than not, you might be able to find them in their clamshell cases, which is kind of neat. Genesis games, for the most part, are very simple in their design. However, Sega Genesis and Sega Mega Drive games for the European market differ from the Japanese games, which are shaped differently. Now, this is Valis, and this is Rocket Knight Adventures here. Now, if you look at them, you'll see that cartridges are shaped physically very different. This means that Sega Genesis games and Sega Mega Drive games from Japan won't work on the same system, even if they aren't region-locked, which depends on the game. Alright, with all that said, let's go over some games, shall we? Now, as always, these are 10 games that I recommend newcomers to the system pick up that aren't necessarily the best games for the system. They're just games that I think that if you're just buying a Genesis, these are games that you should check out. First up is Aladdin. Now, Disney's Aladdin on the Sega Genesis was very different from the Super Nintendo version of the same game. This was done by Virgin Entertainment, and the Super Nintendo one was done by Capcom. Arguably, this is the better version. Ghostbusters. Ghostbusters. Irem's Ghostbusters. Not based on the movies per se, just using the license to create a pretty cool action game. Mortal Kombat 2. Mortal Kombat 2, based upon the arcade game of the same game, is not necessarily a great game. It's not a great fighting game, but it is definitely an iconic game of its era. This is the game that really sparked the creation of the ESRB rating system. Before that, Sega would rate games themselves, such as this MA-17, which is like this predecessor to the ESRB. It's a cool game to pick up, just historically speaking. Not historically speaking, one of the best games for the system, period, Streets of Rage 2. Awesome, awesome beat-em-up. Every owner of the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive should have this game. Everyone should. Another game that I'm a strong advocate for, Thunder Force 2. Now, people will argue which Thunder Force game is the best one. In my opinion, I like Thunder Force 2 more than all the other ones combined. Another arcade port, Strider. Strider on Genesis was a really impressive early game that is a really great port of Strider. To other platforms that this game appeared on, the Genesis version was vastly superior to just about everything. Another early Genesis game, Kid Chameleon. Kid Chameleon is a sort of Mega Man-ish clone where this guy can adorn these costumes and become other things. Very neat. And of course, the last games I should recommend, the Sonic trilogy. Sonic 1, Sonic 2, and Sonic 3. Must-have games. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.